There are words that should carry weight, words that should not be cheap, words that should not just be casual, words that should not be thrown around as though they are merely sound, custom, or atmosphere. And within the life of the church, one of the most overused and under-examined categories of language is kinship language. Brother, sister, sis, bro, family. These are not meant to be empty words. They are not meant to function as religious garnish. They are not meant to sit on top of shallow conduct like decorative icing on poor character. They are not meant to become ecclesial filler, warm in tone but hollow in substance. And yet, in many faith settings, that is exactly what has happened. People use the vocabulary of kingship with extraordinary fluency and very little scrutiny. They say sis because that has become a familiar speech pattern within the life of the church. They say bro because it signals warmth, ease, and shared belonging. They say family because it sounds spiritual, connected, and right. They use the language easily because the culture has taught them the sound of belonging. But there is a difference between learning the language of belonging and carrying the ethics of it. That is where this conversation will continue, because scripture does speak of the household of faith. It does speak of brethren. It does speak of brotherly love. It does frame the people of God as a household, a family, a people formed under one Father. So the issue here is not the language. The issue is what happens when sacred language is retained while sacred responsibility is ignored. The issue is what happens when people preserve the grammar of kingship but evacuate the weight of it. And that is why I am calling this when sis is just syntax. Because sometimes sis is not functioning as substance. It is not carrying loyalty. It is not carrying maturity. It's not carrying honor. It's not carrying responsible love. It's not carrying truthful care. Sometimes it is just syntax, a familiar arrangement of speech, a habitual placement of words, a church-coded greeting, a verbal reflex, a social signal. And if we do not confront that honestly, people will continue mistaking the language of closeness for the reality of it. Now hear me carefully. This is not an attack on warmth. It is not an attack on family language. It is not an attack on spiritual kingship. It is a call to seriousness, because words shape expectation. And when words are used carelessly, people are often handled carelessly too. That is one of the problems in many church settings. Language can become inflated. The terms become bigger than the relationships. The speech becomes warmer than the conduct. The greeting becomes more intimate than the actual treatment. And once that happens, confusion multiplies. Because now somebody is calling you sis, but there is no corresponding evidence of sisterly care. Calling you brother, but there is no brotherly honor. Calling you family, but there is no real stewardship of your well-being, your peace, your dignity, your burden, or your boundaries. So we have to ask the harder question: what exactly is that word doing? If the words sound intimate but the conduct is indifferent, what is the word doing? If the word sounds familial but the posture is extractive, what is the word doing? If the words sound spiritual but the pattern is shallow, what is the word doing? Often, the answer is uncomfortable. The word is not always describing relational reality. The word is often performing social atmosphere. That matters because atmosphere is not nothing. It has effect. Atmospheres create feeling. Atmosphere softens the resistance. Atmosphere produces ease. Atmosphere gives the impression of safety before safety has actually been tested. And this is how people become over-influenced by language. They hear SIS and instinctively lean in. They hear bro and lower their guard. They hear family and assume moral seriousness. They hear warm, faith-coded language and infer character. But language is one of the easiest things to imitate. It is far easier to imitate tone than to embody truth. Far easier to borrow vocabulary than to carry virtue. Far easier to sound safe than actually to be safe. This is why I keep coming back to this line. A spiritual title is not proof of spiritual posture. Let that settle. Because within the life of the church, it is possible to become fluent in the language of belonging long before one has matured in the discipline required to carry it well. People can know the cadence, the phrasing, and the atmosphere of kingship before they have learnt the responsibility, honor, and stewardship that such language should demand. They know the speech, but not the stewardship. They know the greeting, but not the gravity. They know the phrasing, but not the formation. And this is why some of the most misleading dynamics in faith communities are not always found in coldness. They are often found in warmth without weight. Warm words, light discipline. Easy family language, minimal responsibility. That mismatch is exhausting. It is exhausting to be addressed with closeness and treated with carelessness. It is exhausting to be named warmly and handled casually. It is exhausting to be called sister by people who never have taken the responsibility for how they move around your dignity. And that is why conversations like this matter. Because some people are not only confused by relationships, they're confused by speech. The language suggested more than the relationship could carry. The terminology implied more than the conduct could sustain. The tone made an investment that the actual pattern could not repay. Sometimes the language makes an investment that the relationship itself cannot repay. That is what happens when kinship terms are used cheaply. People begin to live inside the emotional credit of the word without ever earning the actual trust, consistency, or responsibility the word implies. And in many faith spaces, this becomes especially dangerous because spiritual language has a way of recruiting the conscience. If somebody calls you sis, it can subtly make you feel obliged, more open, more responsive, more accessible, more hesitant to say no, more likely to comply, more likely to excuse, more likely to assume sincerity. And that is where kingship language can become a soft instrument of manipulation. Not always in loud or in obvious ways, not always through calculated malice, but functionally. Because language creates atmosphere. Atmosphere shapes interpretation, and interpretation influences response. So when somebody says, sis, Can you just, sis, can I ask, sis, can you help? My sis, I need you to. The issue is not merely the request. The issue is whether the language is being used to imply a depth of relational obligation that has never actually been built. That is the concern. The term becomes a soft pressure device, a subtle social key, a way of leaning on closeness that has not yet been tested, a way of borrowing the moral force of sisterhood without carrying the actual ethics of it. And this is why I say, not everyone who says sis has the substance of a sister. That line is not to be harsh. It is clarifying. Because this is not about cynicism. It is about relational literacy. We have to become more literate about what words do, what they suggest, what they imply, what they conceal, what they overpromise, what they normalize. And believers in particular need to become more mature at distinguishing between spiritual vocabulary and spiritual fruit. Because one of the most corrosive things that can happen in a faith community is when language becomes a substitute for formation. Words standing in for character, tone standing in for truth, atmosphere standing in for accountability, kinship language standing in for actual brotherly or sisterly conduct. That is not maturity. That is performance. And let us be honest, a great deal of immaturity survives in the Christian spaces because vocabulary is often allowed to cover what virtue should have exposed. People sound related before they have learned how to be responsible. They sound loving before they have learned how to be disciplined. They sound close before they have learned how to be careful. And that is why disappointment is so common, because many people respond to the speech before they have tested the structure. That is where relational intelligence must step in. Relational intelligence asks, what is actually here? What is the reality beneath the wording? What has this person truly demonstrated? What has the pattern consistently shown? What does their conduct around my dignity reveal? What does their stewardship of my peace reveal? What does their handling of my boundaries reveal? Those are the questions. Not merely, what did they call me? Because words are cheap when they are not regulated by character. Anybody can say sis. Not everybody can function as one. Anybody can say brother. Not everybody can carry brotherhood. Anybody can say family. Not everybody knows how to move with the responsibility that family language should imply. And this is why a person can call you sister and still gossip about you, still mishandle your transparency, still treat your labor as ordinary, still disappear when there is no benefit in being present, still reach for access when there has been no investment, still expect emotional generosity when there has been no relational stewardship. So what exactly was familial about the word? That is the uncomfortable question. Because if the language is warm but the pattern is inconsistent, then the language is not functioning as truth. It is functioning as a signal. And that is one of the reasons church life has become difficult to navigate. It's heavily signaled. There is a lot of coded warmth, a lot of inherited phrases, a lot of family sounding speech, a lot of terms that imply one thing while practical reality often delivers another. Let me go further. I don't think the problem is only overuse. I think the problem is that many people use kinship language by tradition rather than by revelation. They use it because it belongs to the environment, because it belongs to the speech pattern of the setting, because it is part of what believers say. But revelation carries responsibility. Tradition can carry automation. And once speech becomes automatic, it stops disciplining conduct. It merely decorates it. That is a powerful point because sacred language should discipline us. If I use the word sister, something in that word should check my conduct. It should regulate my motive. It should constrain my carelessness. It should call me to honor. It should remind me that the person before me is not merely a familiar face in a room, but someone who belongs to God, someone who must not be handled casually. That is what maturity would look like. But when the word becomes automatic, that restraint disappears. Now it is just a sound, just phrasing, just syntax. And when that happens, the church begins to preserve the vocabulary of family more easily than the discipline of it. That line. The church has preserved the vocabulary of closeness more easily than the discipline of it. There are people who know how to sound like family, but do not know how to move like it. That is not a small issue. Because once language and life split apart, disappointment enters quietly. Not always through dramatic betrayal, sometimes through repeated contradiction. The greeting says warmth, the treatment says distance, the word says closeness, the pattern says convenience, the tone says sisterhood, the reality says selective interest. The phrase says family. The fruit says function. And that contradiction wears people down, especially sincere people, especially generous people, especially those who are naturally responsive, especially those who want to believe the best, especially those who still have a soft reading of spiritual language. And I am not here to harden people. I am here to sharpen them. Because the answer is not suspicion. The answer is yes, again, precision. Not bitterness, precision. Not withdrawal from all warmth, precision. Not cynicism about everybody who says sis or bro, precision. Because relational intelligence is not the death of love, I say again. It is the end of naivety. You must learn to hear language without being ruled by it, to appreciate warmth without surrendering discernment, to receive kindness without assuming tested depth, to participate in community without exaggerating what every term proves. That is maturity. Now let me ask a few difficult questions. Who in your life speaks with the vocabulary of closeness, but has never really demonstrated the responsibility of it? Who sounds familiar, but only appears when there is something to access, request, borrow, or benefit from? Who has mastered the language of inclusion while remaining immature in the ethics of it? And then comes the harder question. Have you ever done the same? Have you ever used the language because it belonged to the room without really examining what the word should require of your conduct? Have you ever spoken warmly where you had not yet built weight? Have you ever inherited a faith community phrase without carrying its seriousness? Have you ever mistaken spiritual fluency for spiritual maturity? Because this conversation is not about pointing fingers at some vague other. It is for all of us. We all need to examine how we use language, how we create atmosphere, how we imply closeness, how we speak belonging, how we attach words to people without considering what those words should cost us ethically. That is part of formation discipleship, because identity is not just about knowing who you are in God. It is also about being formed enough to handle people in ways that are consistent with the language you use around them. This is where identity architecture comes into the picture. Because if identity is not being built properly, language will often outrun formation. If posture is not being built properly, speech will outrun stewardship. If inner architecture is weak, people will borrow relational language they do not yet have the maturity to embody. So this is not just about relational problems. It is a formation problem. It is about what kind of people we are becoming. What kind of structures are being built in us? Whether our speech is flowing from formed character or merely inherited environment. That is why greenfield thinking matters here as well. Because some of us have inherited old relational habits, old church codes, old ways of sounding connected without doing the deeper work of discernment, accountability, and honor. And maturity requires that we do not simply repeat what the culture has handed us. We must examine it, refine it, bring it under the discipline of truth, bring it under formation, bring it under the integrity of what we claim to believe. That is the work. Not simply sounding spiritual, but becoming structured enough to justify the speech we use. Now let me sharpen this once more. One of the reasons people get hurt in faith communities is not always because they were deceived by malicious people. Sometimes they were overpersuaded by familiar language. They are moved by the tone, moved by the warmth, moved by the family-coded speech, moved by the easy language of kinship. And because the speech felt spiritually legible, they assumed the substance was there. But not every person who sounds legible is mature. Not every person who sounds safe is tested. Not every person who uses family language is carrying family ethics. And until you learn that, you will continue to be overly influenced by rhetoric of closeness. This is why this phrase matters. Do not mistake ecclesial fluency for relational integrity. Some people are simply fluent in church culture. They know how to sound like they belong, how to sound soft, how to sound close, how to sound safe, how to sound reverent, how to sound familiar. But fluency is not fruit. And if the pattern contradicts the phrase must be demoted. That's key. When the pattern contradicts the phrase must be demoted. Do not give the word more authority than the conduct supporting it. That is how you protect your peace without becoming cold. That is how you remain loving without becoming gullible. That is how you stay open without becoming overexposed. Now let me bring this to a close. When SIS is just syntax, what is really being exposed is a gap between language and formation. The mouth has learned community, but the soul has not learned responsibility. The speech has learned warmth, but the character has not learned honor. The vocabulary has learned kinship, but the behavior has not learned stewardship. And where that gap exists, confusion will continue until discernment matures. So maturity sounds like this. I can appreciate the language without surrendering my evaluation. I can receive warmth without overreading it. I can honor spiritual family without pretending that every term of kinship signals tested depth. I can love people sincerely without becoming careless with the words that should carry weight. That is the point. Not to reject family language, but to recover its seriousness. Not to become suspicious of every sis, every bro, or every family member, but to stop assuming the words proves what only character can prove. Not to attack the rhetoric of family, but to insist the rhetoric be governed by reality. Because the Bible gives the church language of kingship, yes, but it does not give us permission to turn sacred words into empty performance. And it is what this episode is confronting. We cannot continue to perform belonging through vocabulary while avoiding the deeper work of formation. We cannot keep using spiritual language as though tone is enough, as though atmosphere is enough, as though familiar phrasing is enough. No. If we are going to use the language of family, then let us become the kind of people for whom that language still means something disciplined, costly, and true. Let us become people whose words are restrained by honor, whose greetings are governed by integrity, whose warmth is backed by weight, whose speech does not create false obligations, whose language does not overpromise what our character cannot sustain. Because the sound of kingship is not the same as the substance of it. And relational intelligence means you stop responding to the sound of closeness where the structure of closeness has never actually been built. Now, this is not harshness. That is clarity. That is maturity. That is formation. That is how language regains its weight. I will speak to you in the next episode of our WOW conversations on relational intelligence. Until then, keep building in the wealth of the word.